So many of these patient complaints are a result of basic GI dysfunction. The first form of basic GI dysfunction is hyperpermeability. The GI mucosa, or the GI wall, is both selective and protective. What do I mean by that? It's selective to be able to allow small things to get through, like nutrients, to be able to feed the intestinal wall and the rest of the body. It's protective in keeping out large things, like undigested proteins, and other large molecules and possibly organisms from getting into the system. So it is both selective and protective. But when it becomes hyperpermeable, then you have the opposite situation. It is no longer protective in keeping out the large molecules. Those large molecules can actually slip through the intestinal wall, as shown in the diagram of the unhealthy intestinal tract to the right, where you actually see sort of that crevasse right there. It allows these large molecules to get through, which will lead to such things as autoimmune disorders, inflammation, and certain forms of allergic responses like food allergies. The second thing that hyperpermeability does is when you have this breakdown of this protective wall, you also have the breakdown of what's known as active transport. And active transport is the mechanism by which the smaller things get through the intestinal wall and get into the body. Those things are nutrients. So this active transport system tends to break down because there's lots of inflammation in the intestinal wall. And that means that the nutrients are not being absorbed into the system. So basically, what you can say to your doctors is that we not only have situations in which we have inflammation inside the gut, and we also have things like food allergies, but we also have a situation where all of the other nutrients that you use are not being absorbed well enough. And it drastically lowers the actual ability for your therapeutic approaches to work when it comes to vitamins, minerals, herbs, whatever needs to be absorbed through the gastrointestinal tract. And they're certainly not getting the bang for their buck when it comes to the nutrients from their food. So that's hyperpermeability. The next area is yeast and small bowel bacterial overgrowth. This is really important to point out. You'll notice on the right-hand side, you'll see those strange sort of like multi-legged things. They're green and they're white that are sitting on top of the unhealthy intestinal tract. You may want to point to those. Yeast overgrowth and small bowel bacterial overgrowth is usually a byproduct of there not being enough good bacteria there. So yeast tends to take the space, the surface area up, when the good bacteria is not covering it. It's a matter of surface area. So we want to be able to make sure that the yeast is not there, and that yeast can become systemic and end up in the rest of the body as well. We don't want to be able to have that, so we want to be able to make sure that yeast overgrowth is not happening. The next area is GI mucosal damage. GI mucosal damage, you'll notice on the left-hand side of the intestinal tract that on the left, the junctures between the different cells are very tight, and that's the way they're supposed to be. They're known as colonic junctures. If you take to the right, you'll notice that the junctures are far away from each other. That allows organisms and particles to get caught in there, forming overall damage in that area. And the interesting point is you'll find gut-associated lymphoid tissue, that's known as GALT or G-A-L-T, becomes inflamed, and that inflammation gets sent to all the different parts of the body. So when you have yourself gut mucosal damage, you end up getting inflammation not only in the gut, but through the rest of the body. Interestingly enough is when you start sending inflammatory factors throughout the body, the first place that they go past the intestines is into something called portal circulation. And portal circulation goes directly to the liver. And when you have the liver getting inflamed, then all of a sudden it starts sending inflammatory factors out to the rest of the body. You can even end up with inflammation inside the brain because the glial cells, or the white blood cells in the brain, start becoming inflamed as well. In the liver, those same white blood cells are known as Kupffer cells. So it's important to know that GI mucosal damage can lead to not only intestinal inflammation, but inflammation throughout the entire body.